The year was 1842, and the summer sun hung over Georgia like a curse. From the red clay road that wound through the pines, the Whitfield plantation shimmered in the heat, miles of cotton stretching white as bone beneath a sky that never seemed to end. The great house rose from that land like a monument to pride, white columns gleaming, shutters painted the color of dusk. Every board built to remind the world that the Whitfields were better than the world around them. Inside that house, Elellanena Whitfield ruled alone. Her husband, Thomas Whitfield, had died the year before. Fever, they said, though others whispered darker things. When he passed, she buried him with no tears, only a stillness that frightened even the preacher. The day after the funeral, she walked through the fields at dawn, her black skirts brushing against the dew-wet cotton, and every man, woman, and child who worked that land lowered their eyes. From that morning on, the widow became queen of a kingdom no one dared to question. The plantation ran like clockwork, overseers barked orders. The enslaved rose before the first light, and labored until the cicadas fell silent at dusk. From her balcony, Elellanena watched it all, tall and pale, unmoving, a statue carved from ambition and iron. Behind her civility and lace, though something was beginning to rot, she had 5 daughters, each one lovely, each trained to move like a lady, polite smiles, straight backs, soft laughter. But when Elellanena looked at them, her eyes grew cold. "They have my grace," she once whispered before the mirror, but not his strength. Her husband's portrait hung over the hearth, Thomas Whitfield, stern and handsome, his painted eyes fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. In the evenings she'd pour a glass of Madeira and sit before that portrait for hours, the house quiet except for the tick of the clock and the rustle of her pen across ledgers. Those ledgers were more than accounts. They were records of legacy, births, deaths, cotton yields, debts owed and repaid. To Elellanena they were scripture, but the widow had begun to believe something that no scripture could justify. In her mind, the Whitfield bloodline was divine, purer, chosen, destined. She saw herself not as a woman keeping land alive, but as the guardian of a holy lineage. And without a son to carry it, she felt the curse of extinction pressing down on her shoulders. That belief festered. She began spending her nights in her husband's study, poring over his papers, staring into the fire as though it spoke secrets only she could hear. The servants said she never slept anymore. Some claimed they saw her pacing the halls, whispering to the empty chair where her husband used to sit. Then, one morning, she noticed a man in the fields. He was taller than the rest, his shoulders broad, his movements precise. The overseer called him Josiah, a man sold down from Virginia years ago. He worked hard and spoke little, kept his eyes low, but there was something in his silence that unsettled the others, a calm too deep to be submission. The first time Elellanena saw him, it wasn't through lust or pity, it was calculation. Her gaze lingered longer than it should have. When she turned away, her pulse was steady, her mind already turning over the thought that had taken root like poison ivy. Strength must be bred, purity must be preserved, the line must be perfected. By the next month, she had ordered the overseer to move Josiah closer to the main house. "He's reliable," she said simply. "I'll have use for him." The old housemaid Ruth muttered that nothing Elellanena did was ever without purpose. "Miss Ellie don't just see a man," she whispered one night to the kitchen girls. "She sees a piece in some game the rest of us can't see," and she was right. That evening, Elellanena sat by her fire, staring again at the portrait of her husband. "You failed to give me a son," she murmured, tracing the line of his jaw with one finger. "But I will finish what you started." Outside, the wind swept through the cotton fields, bending the white rose under a blood-red sunset. The house creaked. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed softly on its own. In that sound, something began. From that night forward, the widow of Whitfield Hall stopped being just a woman. She became an architect of something darker, a plan born not from love or lust, but from a hunger for control so deep it could swallow a soul whole. And in her ledger, on a fresh page written in perfect script, she wrote a single line. The summer of 1843 arrived like a punishment. The heat came before dawn and lingered past midnight, turning the air thick and mean. Even the insects seemed to hum slower that year, as though the whole land were holding its breath. The cotton fields shimmered like white fire under the sun, and every soul on the Whitfield estate felt something building, though none dared name it. That was the summer Elellanena Whitfield summoned Josiah to the veranda. He came in silence, his shirt damp from labor, his hands rough from years in the fields. The overseer had sent word that the mistress wanted him near the house. No reason given, no refusal allowed. Elellanena sat high-backed in a carved chair, lace fan moving lazily in her hand. Her daughters watched from behind the curtain, whispering. The widow's gaze rested on him, long and measured, not as a person looks at another, but as one appraises livestock. "You are Josiah," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, eyes low. "I've heard you're strong," she said, "obedient, capable of hard work. I try to be, ma'am." "From today," she said, leaning forward slightly, "you'll work under my direction. The overseer will report to me." Josiah nodded. But something in her tone, Wouter, that quiet authority, too smooth to be kindness, stirred unease in his gut. It wasn't what she said. It was what she didn't. To anyone listening, it sounded like a reward. To Josiah, it felt like a warning. That night in the quarters, the talk began. Ruth, the old house servant, found him sitting outside, the light from the cabins flickering against his face. She brought him a bowl of stew and lowered her voice. "They say the mistress got plans for you," she whispered. "You best be careful, boy. Ain't no safety in a white woman's favor." Josiah didn't answer. He had seen too much to be surprised, but the stillness in him deepened. He remembered Virginia, his wife, his child, the day they were sold. He remembered the promise he'd made to himself then, never again to be used by another soul, no matter what name they wore. The next week, Elellanena began to test him. She ordered him to repair the roof over the parlor, to fetch wood for her fires, to tend the garden outside her window. Every task brought him closer to the house, closer to her gaze. From the balcony, she'd watch him work, unmoving, expressionless. One afternoon, her eldest daughter, Marianne, found her mother standing there, eyes fixed on Josiah as he lifted a beam into place. "Mama," Marianne said, hesitant, "why are you watching him like that?" Elellanenna's voice was low. "A mother must choose carefully, my dear. The future of this house depends on strength, not softness." Marianne frowned but said nothing. Her mother's eyes never left the man below. By midsummer, the heat had grown unbearable. Tempers ran short, and even the cicadas screamed like the damned. One evening, Elellanena ordered Josiah to serve wine at dinner, an unusual request. Her daughters sat still as statues while he poured, his movements careful, silent. "Strong hands," Elellanena said aloud, her tone distant. "Hands that could shape destiny." The youngest daughter, Clara, went pale. Marianne dropped her spoon. The room fell into such silence that even the clock seemed afraid to tick. After dinner, the mistress dismissed everyone, except Josiah. The daughters listened from the stairs as slow footsteps crossed the hall. A door creaked open, then closed, and after that, nothing. From that night onward, Josiah became a shadow in the great house. He fixed doors, mended furniture, carried wood, always near the mistress, never far from her sight. The daughters stopped speaking at supper. The servants stopped laughing in the kitchen. Even the overseer avoided the veranda. In the stillness of those nights, Elellanena sat in her husband's study, writing in a black leather journal. Her words were neat, deliberate, like scripture carved into flesh. "The new Whitfield line will rise from strength. My daughters will bear greatness." One night, Josiah tried to speak. He stood before her, his body tense, voice low. "Ma'am, I mean no disrespect," he said. "But this, whatever you ask of me, it's not right." Elellanenna's face hardened. "You will do as I say, Josiah," she said. "You owe your life to this house. You belong to it, every part of you." He met her eyes then, calm but unyielding. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "No one owns my soul." The words struck like thunder in a silent room. Elellanenna's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes cracked. For the first time, she saw him not as property, not as power, but as defiance. And defiance, to her, was unforgivable. From that night on, she watched him with a different hunger, no longer curiosity, but fury. Outside, the fields whispered in the dark. The first storm of summer was building. And within the walls of Whitfield Hall, a war of wills had begun, one that would end in blood, in fire, and in ruin. By late August, the air itself had turned against them. Each sunrise bled red through a haze of dust and heat, and the fields no longer sang with work. They groaned. The cotton was thick, heavy on the branch, but the harvest came slower each day. The people whispered that the land could feel it, that something unholy had settled over Whitfield Hall. Inside, the great house felt smaller by the week. The windows stayed shuttered against the glare, and the halls, once echoing with chatter, grew quiet as a tomb. Every step, every whisper seemed to carry weight. Elellanena Whitfield had stopped smiling. She moved through her home like a ghost in black silk, her daughters following in her wake, silent and obedient. They had learned to fear the sound of her footsteps. When she spoke, they listened. When she watched, they froze. Mary Ann, the eldest, had begun to notice the change first. At night, she'd find her mother still awake, writing by candlelight, her pale face flickering between shadow and flame. Once, Mary Ann crept close enough to see what she wrote. The words were exact, neat, deliberate. Purity demands purpose. Weakness corrupts the divine. Strength must be passed on, even through sin. Mary Ann stepped back in horror. Her heart pounding, her mother's pen didn't waver. A few days later, Elellanena gathered her daughters in the parlor. The air was thick with the smell of magnolia and candle smoke. Josiah stood nearby, silent, eyes lowered, waiting for orders. "My dears," the widow began, her tone sweet as syrup, "you are my pride, my reason. But our family carries a sacred burden, one this world will never understand." The younger girls shifted uncomfortably. Mary Ann met her mother's gaze. "What burden, mother?" "To endure," Elellanena said, "to keep our blood unbroken, to make the line strong." The second daughter, Louise, swallowed. "But people are already talking," she whispered. "The preacher's wife," Elellenena's voice cracked like a whip. "The preacher's wife is a fool. Let her talk. She knows nothing of destiny." Her eyes swept over her daughters, 5 young faces pale with confusion and dread. "The world takes what it wants from the weak," she said softly. "We are not weak. We are chosen." Mary Ann's hands trembled in her lap. In that moment she saw it clearly. Her mother's faith had curdled into madness. That night, while the house slept, Mary Ann crept through the hall and stopped outside her mother's study. The door was half open. Inside, Elellanena sat before the fire, whispering softly as she wrote. Mary Ann listened. The words were quiet, almost prayerful. "He is the vessel. The seed of renewal. The blood must mix for the new Whitfields to rise." Her breath caught. Her knees weakened. For a moment she couldn't move. Then the floor creaked beneath her step. Elellenena's head turned sharply. "Who's there?" Mary Ann fled, heart hammering. She didn't stop until she reached the far end of the hall, pressing her back to the wall, trembling. From the study her mother's voice carried faintly. Not angry, not afraid. Just calm, almost smiling. "Curiosity," she said to the empty room, "is the first sin of the ungrateful." The next morning, Elellanena began keeping her daughters close. They were no longer allowed into town. No visitors, no letters. The world outside might corrupt them, she said. The family's future depended on silence and control. She had new dresses made, all white, all matching. "For a portrait," she explained, though no painter ever came. Josiah worked under watch again, always near the house. The overseer followed him like a shadow. Every time he lifted a tool, he felt eyes on his back. Not the overseer's, but hers. That night, as thunder rolled across the fields, Mary Ann found him standing beneath the oak by the quarters, staring into the storm. The rain began to fall, heavy, relentless. "She's not well," Mary Ann said, her voice shaking. "She's losing herself." Josiah looked at her, calm, steady, sorrowful. "I know," he said. "But she won't stop. Not until someone makes her." Mary Ann's throat tightened. "Then she'll destroy us all." He nodded slowly. "Maybe. But some fires don't stop until they burn through everything." When Mary Ann returned to the house, her mother was waiting. Elellanena stood by the doorway, candle in hand, her face white and unreadable. "You've been walking," she said softly. "In the rain." "Yes, mother. With whom?" "No one." Elellanena stepped closer. The flame trembled between them. "You forget," she whispered. Whitfield does not lie." Her eyes gleamed in the candlelight, sharp as broken glass. "Sleep well, my dear. You'll need strength for what's coming." Mary Ann lay awake that night, listening to the wind lash against the shutters. Somewhere down the hall a door creaked. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, passing her room, moving toward the back stairs where Josiah slept, and with each step, the house seemed to breathe, alive, watching, waiting. The storm outside raged until dawn, but the real storm was already inside the walls of Whitfield Hall. Autumn crept in without mercy. The heat broke, but the air in the house stayed heavy, thick with secrets no prayer could cleanse. The servants spoke in whispers again, about doors that opened on their own, about the mistress pacing the halls with a candle long past midnight. Mary Ann could barely stand to be in the same room with her mother. Elellanena had stopped attending church. She called the preacher, a small man with a smaller God. She spent her nights in the study, writing in that black leather book she kept locked in her drawer. One night, when the house slept, Mary Ann slipped inside. The journal lay open on the desk as if waiting. Lines of perfect handwriting marched across the page. The blood must mix. The seed is chosen. The vessel stands ready beneath my roof. Her stomach turned. She slammed the book shut and stepped back, but a voice from the doorway froze her. "You shouldn't read what isn't yours," Elellanena said quietly. Mary Ann spun around. "Mother, this is madness." Elellanenna's face was calm, almost kind. "No, child. This is destiny. You can't use him," Mary Ann cried. "He's a man, not an animal." The widow's hand struck before the sentence finished. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "Enough," Elellanena hissed. "You will obey me." Mary Ann's cheek burned, but worse was the cold certainty in her mother's eyes, eyes that believed themselves righteous. That night, she ran through the rain to the servants' quarters. She found Josiah sharpening an old cane knife, the blade gleaming faintly in the lamplight. "She's lost her mind," she whispered. "She means to use you, to use all of us." Josiah looked up slowly. "I know," he said, "but some things don't stop till somebody stands in their way." Mary Ann's voice broke. "If you try, she'll kill you." He gave a faint smile. "Maybe, but better to die standing than live on my knees." A long silence hung between them, broken only by the drum of rain on the roof. When dawn came, the house stood quiet again, white columns shining clean as if nothing unholy had passed beneath them. But inside, the widow was already writing her next line. The storm returned that night, wild and unrelenting. Rain battered the windows, and the old house moaned beneath the wind. The candles in the hall flickered, their light dancing like frightened souls. Josiah waited in the shadows near the servants' stairs, listening. Upstairs he could hear Elellanenna's voice, low, furious, trembling with something between rage and despair. "She's corrupted them," she hissed to no one. "My own daughter has turned them against me." Mary Ann was locked in her room. Her sisters cried behind closed doors. The servants avoided the mistress entirely. No one dared breathe too loud. Josiah knew what came next. He'd seen that madness before, the kind that swallowed men whole. If he waited until morning, someone would die. He slipped quietly down the back hall, found Ruth near the kitchen hearth. Her old eyes met his, and without a word she nodded. "It's time," she whispered. The word spread in silence. A few men gathered near the stables, their faces wet with rain and fear. No one spoke of freedom anymore, just escape. Josiah looked back once at the mansion. The tall white columns glowed pale in the lightning, the symbol of everything that had chained them. He clenched his jaw. "Tonight," he said, "we end this." Ruth pressed a small wooden cross into his hand. "The Lord's done waiting on this place," she murmured. "Now it's our turn." Upstairs, Elellanena sat at her desk, the black journal open before her. Her hand trembled as she wrote, ink smearing on the page. "The blood must bind before the dawn. If the vessel defies me, I will destroy the vessel." A sound interrupted her, the faint creak of the front door. She froze. Then slowly she rose and reached for the pistol Thomas had kept in the drawer. The storm raged louder. Josiah moved fast. He helped Mary Ann from her room, her wrists still bruised from where the servants had tied her door shut. "We have to go," he said. "Now," she hesitated. "My sisters, they'll follow if they can. You can't save everyone tonight." As they reached the stairs, a voice cut through the thunder. "Josiah!" Elellanena stood at the end of the hall, pistol in hand, candlelight flickering across her face. Her hair had come loose, wild around her shoulders. "You think you can steal from me?" she shouted. "After all I've given." "You were chosen." Josiah turned to face her, his voice steady. "I was owned." "That's not the same thing." The The two locked eyes, power and defiance, faith and fury. Then lightning struck, white and blinding. The pistol fired. The shot echoed through the house, through the fields, through the rain. When the light faded, Elellanena Whitfield was on her knees, the pistol slipping from her hand. Josiah stood unmoving, smoke rising from his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. Marianne pulled him toward the door. "We have to go." Behind them, the curtains caught flame from the candles' fall. Fire climbed the walls, devouring silk and wood alike. By the time they reached the fields, the great house was burning, an inferno consuming generations of pride and sin. The columns cracked, the roof caved, and with a final roar, Whitfield Hall collapsed into its own ashes. Under the downpour, Josiah and Marianne looked back only once. The fire glowed against the storm, and for a moment, it seemed as if the sky itself was cleansing the land. "Where will you go?" she asked. He looked toward the dark line of the forest. "Where the name Whitfield don't mean a thing." Then he turned, and the night swallowed him. Behind them, the last screams of the old world faded into thunder, and by morning, the widow's empire was gone. Morning broke grey over the ruins of Whitfield Hall. Smoke curled into the damp air, carrying the sharp scent of charred wood and something far worse, history burning. The mansion's columns lay cracked and blackened. The great balcony collapsed into the ashes of a legacy that had devoured itself. The people from nearby plantations came at midday, drawn by the rising smoke. None dared step close at first. They said the widow's spirit still walked among the ruins, searching for what she had lost. By the third day, all that remained were the bones of the house and the black journal, half burned, half saved, found near the old desk. The preacher from town took it, read a few pages, and closed it without a word. "Some things," he said quietly, "ain't meant for the living." Marianne survived. She and her sisters were taken in by a distant cousin in Savannah, though none spoke openly about the fire. In polite company it was said lightning struck the roof, a tragedy, nothing more. But Marianne carried the truth like a scar. She'd seen the madness, heard the final words, felt the heat of her mother's sin. At night she still dreamed of the storm, of Josiah standing in the rain with fire behind him. She never knew if he lived or died. Some swore they saw a tall man heading west along the river road, moving silent as shadow. Others said he'd been taken by the flames. Marianne believed neither. She knew a man like him didn't die easy. Months passed. The fields grew wild again, the cotton gone to weeds. The Whitfield name vanished from ledgers and county talk, replaced by stories whispered around hearths after dark. Stories of a widow who tried to play God and a man who defied her. They called it the Georgia widow's curse. Some said if you stood by the ruins on a moonless night, you could still hear the sound of her voice through the wind, commanding, pleading, unrepentant. Others said it wasn't her voice at all, but his, the man who broke her spell. Years later, when Marianne was grown and grey, she returned once, standing at the edge of what had been her family's empire. Nothing remained but vines and the old stone steps leading to nowhere. She knelt, pressed her palm to the earth, and whispered, "It's over." But deep beneath that soil, under the roots and ruin, lay the ashes of a house built on pride and sin, and the echo of a name that refused to stay buried. Weeks after the fire, whispers spread through the back roads and trading posts. A tall man had been seen crossing the Oconee River at dusk. He carried no pack, no tools, only a scar across his shoulder and eyes that never lingered long on anyone's face. The locals called him the man who walked away from hell. He gave no name, but those who met him said he spoke with calm words and quiet strength. Some said he worked for a spell at a mill near Milledgeville, fixing gears and wheels without complaint. Others swore he moved west, following the rivers toward freedom, never staying long enough to leave a trail. No one knew it was Josiah. That was the point. He didn't look back. Behind him lay a house that had tried to claim his soul, a woman who'd mistaken power for divinity, and a fire that had swallowed both. Ahead was only road and sky, wide, merciless, clean. At night, when the wind shifted east, he thought he could still smell smoke. He'd wake, heart pounding, half expecting to see the white columns glowing through the trees. But there was only darkness, and the soft sound of water against the rocks. Freedom, he learned, was not peace. It was the long ache of remembering. Once, in a small town near the Alabama line, he worked for a preacher who didn't ask questions. On Sundays, Josiah would sit at the back of the church, listening to hymns about forgiveness and redemption. The preacher's wife asked once if he believed in salvation. Josiah looked at his hands, rough and scarred. "Salvation," he said quietly. "I reckon that's for folks who had a choice." She didn't ask again. Years turned. The war came, then ended. The world changed, but the land remembered. Travelers still told the story of the widow who went mad trying to perfect her bloodline and the man who burned her world down to save his soul. Some called it justice, others tragedy, but Josiah never spoke of it. To him it wasn't legend, it was survival. One night, decades later, an old man sat by the river carving a small wooden cross from driftwood. His hands shook, but his eyes were steady. When he finished, he set it in the soil and whispered, "For those she took, and for the ones who lived." The wind rose softly through the trees, carrying the smell of rain. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, a low, familiar warning. Josiah closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he let himself rest. Years passed. Wars came and ended. Borders shifted, and the old names of Georgia faded into history. But the story of the Whitfield widow endured. The great house was gone, its columns toppled and smothered in ivy. The steps led nowhere now, ending at an empty field where wildflowers grew through cracked stone. Travelers passing the road still spoke softly as they went by, whispering, "Here lived the woman who tried to play God, and the man who burned her heaven down." Mary Ann lived quietly in Savannah, grey-haired and watchful. She raised her younger sisters, spoke to no one of the fire, and avoided mirrors. On stormy nights she would sit by the window, listening to the rain lash against the glass, and remember her mother's last words, "There will be no weakness in this house." To that, Mary Ann always whispered the same reply, "There is no house left." One cold morning years later she returned to the ruins. The fields were silent except for the wind through the trees. She walked until she reached the broken threshold where the front door had once stood. Kneeling, she pressed her hand to the dirt. "Josiah," she whispered, "if you lived, stay free. If you didn't, pray for both of us." From her pocket she drew a scrap of burned white cloth, the one she had carried since that night, and buried it beneath the earth. Then she rose and left without looking back. That was her confession and her goodbye. The black leather journal was found later by a preacher searching through the ruins. He read a few lines, then shut it tight and locked it away in the church storeroom. That Sunday he gave a sermon without names. Only a warning. When power becomes faith, even faith will burn. The tale spread through Georgia and beyond, changing with every retelling. Some said on moonless nights the widow's voice still drifted through the trees, whispering, "Keep the blood pure." Others swore it was Josiah's voice instead. Calm and firm, no soul can be owned. Time turned the truth into legend. To some, Josiah became a symbol of defiance, the man who walked away from hell. To others, Elellanena became a ghost, cursed to wander the ashes of her own creation. Many years later, a child once asked an old woman in Savannah, "Was Whitfield Hall real?" The woman, her eyes clouded and distant, answered, "Yes, and that's why it's gone. The rain still falls over those fields. The vines still crawl across the stones. The earth remembers what pride built and what fire purified. And if you listen closely in the dark, you might hear two voices carried by the wind, one commanding, one defying. That's the whole story. Everything else is just ashes.